So, the top 10 most spoken languages in the world, and which one is the hardest to learn. This will just be going over which languages are the most spoken, including both native and non-native speakers, so the people from that country and anyone who's learnt it. And at the end, I'll talk about which ones are the hardest, which ones are the easiest, which ones you should learn. So, number 1. Some people are surprised by it, they think it's number 2, but English is the most spoken language in the world when you combine both native and non-native speakers, so about 1.5 billion people. English is an Indo-European language of the Germanic branch, and generally it is considered to be a fairly difficult language, but because it's the one most people start off with, it's not even really counted. And then obviously you've got English-speaking countries down the bottom. That's not much of a surprise to anyone. We got Mandarin Chinese is second. Most people think it's first. If you're going off native speakers, it is first because almost everyone that speaks Mandarin is a native speaker because of how difficult it is to learn. But there are some people who learn it, and it's second if you count both native and non-native speakers. So it's a Sino-Tibetan language of the Chinese branch, and it's generally considered hard because it has so many different characters. I'll talk about that later. And it has a bunch of things we don't have in English, like tones, difficult pronunciation, all of that. Third would be Hindi, with 602 million people speaking it. Mostly spoken in India, and it uses a script called Devanagari. It's also an Abugida, which means that it's only consonants you write it with, and they're just altered to show the vowel afterwards. It's hard to explain, I won't go into it, but yeah, that can make it a bit difficult. Definitely not the easiest language, but it's probably not as hard as Mandarin. Spanish would be fourth, with 548 million people. Spain and a few other countries, as you'll see, their language is quite spread around the world because of colonization. That's why there's so many people talking it, even though Spain, I think, is only like 40 million people. But it's generally considered to be the easiest or one of the easiest languages for English speakers to learn because it's quite simple and it's not too different. And it's also a Romance language, which makes it easy. It's evolved from Vulgar Latin, like any Romance language, and it's spoken in Spain, Mexico, and Venezuela, as well as 18 other countries. It's interesting that the country it's spoken the most in is Mexico, even though it's from Spain. And that's same with English as well, with English being mostly spoken in the US, and also India, but coming from England, and the same with Portuguese as well, as you'll see. So French has 280 million speakers in 5th place, and it is mostly spoken in France, but it's also spoken in a few other countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and plenty of other islands as well. Like it's spoken in Vanuatu a bit because of also colonization. French is probably harder than Spanish, even though it's a Romance language as well, because of pronunciation, but it's still fairly easy. You've got in 6th place Arabic. Arabic is up there with Mandarin and how difficult it is, in that it's not similar to Mandarin, not at all, but it has things different to English that are really hard to understand. So 274 million people speaking to it. It is interesting to classify because there's different dialects of Arabic, so different groups of people that speak it slightly differently, and it's up for debate whether or not they're different languages or the same language with just regional differences. So it's an Afro-Asiatic language. It makes it quite different from English, and it's spoken by 25 countries throughout the Middle East and Africa. It is also an Abjad, which is one of the reasons why it's so hard. Basically, Abjads only use consonants. They sometimes do put vowels in Arabic, but they basically only use consonants, and it's also almost completely cursive, as you can see down the bottom, and they write from right to left. You wouldn't know that, but they do, and that can make it really hard to read because you have to read right to left, and it's fully cursive, and they just don't have vowels, so it can be difficult. Bengali is in 7th with 272 million speakers. It's an Indo-European language of the Indo-Iranian branch. It's spoken in Bangladesh and parts of India, and it has its own alphabet, which can make it quite difficult. Russian is in 8th. Even though it's 8th, it's actually the 3rd most used language on the internet, which is interesting, and it has a lot of historical ties to places throughout Eastern Europe and Northern Asia, with it being such a big country. It does use an alphabet called Cyrillic, so you wouldn't be able to read it unless you knew this, but it's actually not difficult to learn. Cyrillic, in my opinion, is probably the easiest alphabet for an English speaker to learn. It's sort of a toss-up between that and the Greek alphabet, but I reckon Cyrillic is slightly easier. Just for some reason, I just found it easier. That's it on the next slide. And it's spoken in Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and it's a minority language in a lot of countries, including the US, actually. And then you've got 9 Portuguese, same as Spanish in the sense that it's spoken in a lot of different countries because of colonization, and it's mostly spoken in Brazil, even though it's from Portugal. But yeah, it's a Romance language, and it's fairly easy to learn as well. And then 10th, you've got Urdu, which is spoken in Pakistan and also parts of India. India has 22 national languages, which means a lot of languages commonly spoken are in India, even though, because it's the second biggest country, but it has that many languages spoken in it that a lot of them are spoken there. It's an Indo-European language of the Indo-Iranian branch, and it's written using Natalik, which kind of looks a little bit like Arabic. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart unless you knew it, which is also used for some other languages. Overall hardest is probably Mandarin. I don't speak it, but it's generally considered to be the hardest because of how different it is from English. So it does have over 10,000 characters, so you could basically say it has over 10,000 letters. It just works a little bit differently to English, with characters can make their own unique sounds, and it's almost like writing with pictures rather than using letters, but you can romanize it, which they do sometimes for learners. And it has tones, which is basically where you pronounce things differently to make completely different words, so you've got to be careful with that or you'll say the wrong thing. And it has plenty of other challenging aspects as well. In second place, some people would say Arabic is the hardest, but it's generally considered to be not as hard as Mandarin. It's quite difficult because of the extreme differences. Extreme differences are generally what makes something more difficult. So like Arabic, as I said before, it's written back to front for English speakers. It has no vowels, it's completely cursive, the pronunciation's hard, and Arabic is also meant to have quite difficult grammar with genderization, conjugation, all these kinds of things. And then overall, Spanish, French, and Portuguese are probably the easiest for English speakers to learn because they're the most similar. That's the top 10 hardest languages, and yeah, thank you.